It was late October, and my friend Alex and I decided to check out this corn maze that had popped up just outside town. It was something we did every fall, just to get into the Halloween spirit, but this maze was new. Everyone in school had been talking about how it was way bigger and creepier than the ones we'd been to before. My other friend Jason was the one who insisted we check it out. He had this weird obsession with trying to scare us, and I guess a creepy corn maze at sunset was the perfect opportunity for that. When we got there, the sun was starting to set, casting this orange glow over the cornfields. The air was cold, with just enough wind to make the cornstalks rustle, and honestly, the place already felt a little spooky. But we laughed it off and went in, expecting to just have a fun time getting lost. At first, it was exactly what you'd expect. A bunch of twists and turns, dead ends, and cornstalks that all looked the same. Jason kept running ahead, trying to jump out from behind corners and scare us. It worked a couple of times, but Alex and I were mostly just annoyed by it after a while. We were deep in the maze, and the sounds of other people were starting to fade. It felt like we were the only ones left inside. That's when things started to feel different. The sun had pretty much disappeared by now, and the only light was this dull, reddish glow from the horizon. We kept hitting dead ends no matter which way we went, and after a while, we noticed we were always coming back to the same spot, a tall, dead tree that stood out in the middle of the maze. We'd passed it 3 times already, and each time we got a little more uneasy. "I swear we've been here before," Alex muttered, looking around nervously. "Yeah, no kidding," I replied, trying to hide my own growing anxiety. Jason, on the other hand, seemed to find it funny. "Maybe we're just bad at mazes," he said with a grin, but even he seemed a little off. We kept moving, but the paths all looked the same. The maze felt like it was closing in on us, and the cornstalks were swaying even though there was no wind anymore. Then we heard footsteps. At first, it sounded like someone was running through the corn, like Jason had done earlier. But these footsteps were heavier, slower. They weren't close, but they weren't far either. "Did you hear that?" Alex whispered. I nodded. "Probably just someone else in the maze," I said, but deep down I didn't believe it. Jason, being Jason, decided to run ahead again, shouting back at us, "I'll find the way out, losers." We laughed nervously, but as his footsteps faded, the atmosphere changed completely. The sounds of the maze, rustling corn, distant laughter, seemed to disappear. It was dead quiet, except for the occasional crunch of leaves under our feet. Alex and I kept walking, but after a while we realized we hadn't heard Jason's voice or footsteps for a long time. "Jason!" Alex called out. No response. We tried calling him again, louder this time. Still nothing. The panic started to creep in, and I could see Alex's nerves fraying, which didn't help mine. We decided to go back to the tree. It seemed like the only landmark in this maze, and if Jason had passed it, maybe he was nearby. But when we got back there, Jason wasn't waiting for us. Instead, there was something else. At the base of the tree, tied to one of the branches, was a scarecrow. It hadn't been there the first few times we passed, I was sure of it. Its clothes were torn and covered in dirt, and its burlap head had these hollow black eyes that seemed to follow us as we stood there. But the scariest part was the grin. Its mouth was stitched into a crooked, wide grin. Did Jason do this?" Alex asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I whispered, "but we need to find him. Now." We took off, running through the maze, calling his name over and over. But there was no answer. We tried to retrace our steps, but everything looked the same. The cornstalks were taller than they had been, and the paths seemed narrower. The footsteps came back too, heavy, deliberate, like someone or something was following us. But every time we stopped to look, there was nothing there. After what felt like hours, we stumbled out of the maze, breathless and terrified. But Jason wasn't with us. We told our parents, who called the cops, and we went back the next day with a search party. They went through the entire maze, but they didn't find anything. No sign of Jason. The scarecrow was gone, too. They said he must have gotten lost and made it out on his own, but he never came home. Weeks went by, but the police never found him. To this day, I don't know what happened in that cornfield. But every fall, when the wind picks up and the leaves start to change, I think about Jason, and I wonder if he's still out there, somewhere, trapped, lost in the maze. I work the night shift at a gas station out on a rural highway. Most nights it's quiet with only a few customers stopping by for gas or snacks. It's boring, but it pays the bills. I never really thought much about the late hours or the isolation until last fall. It started as a normal shift. The air was cold, the wind rattling the windows, and the station was dead. Around midnight, this beat-up old truck pulled into the lot. I didn't think much of it. Just another customer, I figured. The guy stepped out wearing a hoodie pulled low over his face. He walked in slowly, almost too slowly, like he was deliberately taking his time. He didn't say anything at first, just browsed the aisles for way longer than necessary. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, feeling uneasy. He kept glancing over at me every few seconds, but I couldn't make out his face under the hood. Eventually, he came up to the counter with a pack of gum and a soda. I rang him up, trying to keep it casual. "Quiet night, huh?" I said, just to break the silence. He didn't respond. He just handed me a crumpled bill, took his stuff, and left without a word. I shrugged it off. Weird people show up sometimes, nothing new. But after that, things started to get strange. A few nights later, the same truck pulled in again. It was almost 2 a.m. this time. The guy didn't get out of the truck right away. He just sat there, engine idling, his headlights pointed straight at the front window of the station. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing, but he stayed there for at least 15 minutes, just staring. Eventually, he drove off without ever getting out of the truck. I started to feel a little creeped out, but I didn't tell anyone. I figured maybe he was just some loner with nowhere to be. The next night, the truck came back. This time he didn't even park. He just drove slowly through the lot, circling the pumps before pulling out onto the highway again. I watched him the whole time, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. From then on, it became a regular thing. Every night, like clockwork, the truck would show up. Sometimes he'd park for a while. Sometimes he'd just circle the lot and leave. He never got out, never came back inside the store. Just watched. After a week of this, I was starting to lose sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about it, wondering what the hell this guy wanted. I told my boss about it, but he just laughed it off, saying, "It's probably just some lonely old guy with nothing better to do." But I wasn't convinced. One night, about a month into this weird routine, the truck didn't show up. I felt relieved, thinking maybe he'd finally found someone else to bother. But halfway through my shift, I got that feeling. You know the one. Like someone's watching you. I looked up from the counter and froze. The guy was standing just outside the glass door, staring at me. He wasn't moving, just standing there with his hands stuffed in his hoodie pocket. His face was still hidden in the shadow of the hood, but I could feel his eyes on me. My stomach dropped, and I had no idea what to do. I thought about locking the door, but I didn't want to make it obvious that I was scared. Instead, I pretended not to notice him, acting like I was busy stocking the shelves behind the counter. After what felt like forever, I glanced back at the door. He was gone. I rushed over and locked the door, my hands shaking. I stayed behind the counter for the rest of the night, watching the security cameras, but he never came back. At least, not that night. The next night, the truck was back in the lot. This time, I didn't wait for him to leave. I called the cops. They came out, but by the time they arrived, the truck was gone again. I explained what had been happening, and they promised to do a few drive-bys throughout the night. For a few days, everything was quiet. No truck, no creepy guy standing at the door. I thought it was over. But then, last week, I found a note taped to the back door of the gas station. It said, "See you soon." I quit the next day. Fall was almost over, and my friend Ben and I decided to go camping one last time before the winter hit. We had this favorite spot deep in the woods, about an hour outside of town. It wasn't a well-known campsite, just a clearing by a small stream we had stumbled across a few years back. We liked it because it was quiet, isolated. Nobody else ever went out that far. We loaded up our gear and headed out on a Friday afternoon. The weather was perfect for a fall camping trip. Crisp air, leaves turning bright orange and red, and the sky clear. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. We set up our tent, built a small fire, and just sat there talking, watching the stars come out. Everything felt peaceful. Around midnight, the fire had burned down to embers, and we decided to call it a night. As we were getting into the tent, I thought I heard something. A branch snapping in the distance. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably just a deer or some other animal, I figured. Ben didn't seem to hear it, and I didn't want to freak him out, so I kept quiet. We crawled into our sleeping bags, and after a while Ben fell asleep, but I couldn't. Something didn't feel right. I kept hearing faint noises, like footsteps, but they were slow, deliberate. Every time I thought it was just my imagination, another twig would snap or leaves would rustle, but it was too rhythmic, too controlled to be just an animal. My mind started racing, thinking about all the horror stories I'd heard about people disappearing in the woods. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. Footsteps, louder this time, coming from the direction of the stream. I froze. Whoever or whatever it was, they were walking in a straight line toward our tent. "Ben," I whispered, nudging him awake. "Do you hear that?" He groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What?" "Listen," I said. The footsteps had stopped. It was dead silent outside. Not even the usual sounds of the forest. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Ben was wide awake now, staring at me. We both sat there, waiting, listening. Then we heard it again. Closer this time, just outside the tent. The sound of boots crunching on dry leaves. Someone was out there. I reached for the flashlight and clicked it on, pointing it at the zipper of the tent, but I didn't unzip it. I didn't want to see who or what was standing outside. Ben grabbed the hunting knife he always brought along, his hand shaking slightly. "Who's out there?" he called out, trying to sound braver than he was. No response. The footsteps stopped again, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. We sat there in the tent, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. Then, the zipper on the tent started to move, just an inch, maybe less, but enough to send a jolt of terror through both of us. I shone the flashlight at the zipper and it stopped. Ben lunged forward, knife in hand, and yanked the zipper the rest of the way down. But no one was there. We stared out into the dark woods, but there was no sign of anyone. No footsteps, no shadows. Just the cold, empty forest. "Let's get out of here," I whispered. Ben didn't argue. We grabbed our stuff, packed up as quickly as we could, and started heading back to the car. The trail was hard to follow in the dark, but we didn't care. We just wanted to get out of those woods. As we were walking, I kept hearing something behind us. Footsteps, always keeping just far enough back that we couldn't see who or what was following. Every time we stopped, they stopped. When we started moving again, so did they. I didn't say anything to Ben because I knew he could hear it too. We both just kept walking faster and faster until we were practically running. By the time we reached the car, it was almost dawn. We threw our stuff in the back and peeled out of there without looking back. It just shows that sometimes humans can be much scarier than the paranormal. Who knows what that stranger would have done if we hadn't woken up?